Good afternoon, folks. We appreciate you being here. It's about 3:30, and we are slated to begin our agenda on the Planning Committee at 3:30. Welcome to all of you. I'm informed of no citizens wishing to address the board.
Let me make sure.
Unless I didn't know.
Do we have anybody signed up? I didn't see any signatures on there. Okay, super.
Okay.
I just want to make sure.
Seeing none, then we will, let me give you a kind of an overview of the agenda today. We don't have a lot of items. We do have some lengthy discussion that we want to be able to have. Probably going to be an executive session in addition to that. So while it's not a long agenda in terms of items, it is quite a bit of discussion points. So Robert, anything on the CEO update?
No, I do not.
Okay. You should have your minutes from your May 2nd meeting. Anybody had any observations about those? If not, we'd entertain a motion. A motion for Dr. Weber, second from Reverend Emerson. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. That's that. Thank you, sir. Okay, so all of you have been very patiently waiting on the next steps relative to the bond project. And I speak for the board. I know in thanking people for their patience and for their support for that project. It's been a long time coming. It has also been a long time since we really had a chance to sit down and start talking about details related to it. One of the factors that was a delay, I'll call it, in us really being able to get together and discuss this at length was the fact that we weren't sure what was going to happen with our friends in the Texas legislature this session and what would happen to hospitals, public hospitals. The good news is when compared to what happened to cities, compared to what happened to public hospitals are in great shape. So cities are not. Roger
and we feel bad for you, but we are delighted, and we are very thankful to our legislative body.
Roger and I can attest to the fact cities are not. So anyway, that was a huge issue for us because had there been substantial changes made to how we are able to calculate our effective tax rate and caps related to that, that would have had a huge impact on bond deployment. And to really head off in a direction without knowing that was kind of irresponsible and a waste of everyone's time. So since that's been resolved, we have been meeting, as you know. There's been an ad hoc subcommittee that has been looking primarily at process related to the bond deployment. This committee really hasn't done anything relative to decisions yet on what needs to be built and when it needs to be built. That has always been an area that the Commissioners Court has really looked carefully to the board to advise them on. And so today we're going to start that process in earnest. I've asked the staff to put together quite a bit of information for you. I hope that you all got a chance to either review what you've already read or if you haven't read it at all, the past reports that go all the way back to Boca Powell for the board's actions relative to master campus planning, the HCA reports, the Cummings report, the Blue Ribbon Committee. I mean, there is enough paper here to choke a mule when it comes to the amount of work that's been done to get us to where we are today. That's preparatory in terms of, recognizing that we have sort of in a point where we're going to have to assimilate a gigantic amount of information down to some pretty simple steps and pretty simple calendars that we now have to begin, adhering to. So with that, before we bring the staff up, one of the things I've asked to do is I've asked the staff to bring us sort of their perspective right now on where we are related to the history of this activity. I knew that the committee, and by the way, we will be acting today as the board since we have a majority of the board present, and this was published as a board meeting, so we can avoid having to take additional steps on this. But because we wanted to, get to a point where we could make this move as quickly as possible, I really wanted the staff to be able to present to you their perspective on the recommendations that they see today. Where are we today at JPS? What are the facility needs? Obviously, a lot of water has gone under the bridge. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of activity since we last met relative to campus planning. I didn't really want us to have to go down a trail chasing rabbits if we hadn't heard the staff's communication on this and their perspective and their recommendations. So we've got a lot of background data. We're more than happy to keep this agenda very fluid today and be sure that if you have questions at any point, that you stop the staff and that you ask them those questions, because we'll spend as much time as necessary to make sure that there's adequate discussion and there's clarity on these items. So that's really our key for the day. So with that, Robert, let me turn it over to you, and I know you're going to bring up the team, and we'll jump
bet.
in.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, very much. And a couple comments that I would like to make in addition to Trent's articulate outlining of that is, I'm a big believer that the balance between the court and the board can be very amicable and valuable. The court has a very vested interest in this. These are elected officials that have a duty and a responsibility to their constituents. They're also the people that put this bond package on a ballot. And you all as a board have the particulars of knowing what goes on here and the luxury of having monthly meetings and in some cases what appears to be daily committee meetings. You all are informed in everything, and that synergy between the two, I think, is going to be hugely beneficial as we go through this bond package. To Trent's point, aside from the ability to choke a mule, we also have a trend that you can look back. If you go back to the Boca Powell project way back in 2009 and 2010, you read through that, and then you go through some of Blue Cottage's reports, and you go through HMA's reports, you'll see the trend. None of that amount of paperwork gives you a diversion in the direction that we've been taking. So in that regard, I think where we want to be, where you as a board want to be, where our Commissioners Court wants to be, is all focused on the patient and our responsibility from a stewardship standpoint to the community that provided us the funds to do this. And that's where we're going to be, and that's where staff is going to emphasize what we're going to look at. So what I like to do is have Bill come up, and I'm going to have Lou come up, and I'm going to have Angie come up. These are three talented folks. Obviously, you all know them. We have moved Lou Mattingly into a new director's role to allow Lou to help us with some of the initial construction aspects and help us with a lot of the work that we're doing on the bond as we preliminary get into this. You're at some point obviously going to have an outside source which helps manage some of these things. But Lou is very talented person at trying to help us with some of these. So I'm going to let them go into some of the details, but what I wanted to do is let you all know that and we'll go into more of the details of the recommendations, but the way we as staff see things is we have an opportunity to jumpstart this process in a very good way, because there are construction designs and there are architects that have been in place for the prototype of our Northeast Clinic. When we put the Northeast Clinic in, it's our last clinic to go in. We were groundbreaking that 9 months ago from here. And that can be something that we can bring to the community for other sites. Mr. Chairman, you and Steve both know that your work on the Blue Ribbon Committee suggested that there be 4 outreach facilities. We ultimately want to get to 4. Maybe we want to get to 5 or 6, but at this time, we as staff would recommend that we start that process with 2 locations. And before I even finish that statement, that begs a question from half of you, if not all of you in the audience, is where they're going to be. Because that's where the lick log starts, and that is, where are they going to be? We're not at that point. We can tell you, looking at preliminary site maps, looking at where we would go, we think we can begin to address, and I don't want to go too far deep into 4 locations immediately, because it's an ever-changing process and need for JPS, but I think we could begin to address some of the initial needs of this community and our county if we looked at 2 facilities. So the staff will go into a little more detail about that, but I just want to have y'all hear me. We don't have site locations, and the purpose of this meeting today is not to pick a site location because we're not prepared for that yet. But we are prepared to let you know that it would be a facility that has been doing quite well in the Northeast, and that is a prototype for us. The second thing that I would want to communicate to y'all is what Trent you and Pastor Emerson and Dorothy and DT and all have worked on, and Chuck have worked on for so long, and that is, how do you enhance patient care services here? The challenges that we have with having clinics on the second floor of this building, which a waiting room is a hallway, which the actual procedure room is the size of the trunk of your car, and it's challenging, and it's been a challenge for a long time. The other need of aspects of other patient care services, you all approved of an architect, and we talked about an ambulatory surgery center, and in the Blue Ribbon Committee, it brings up the ambulatory surgery center. We would like to, for vernacular sense, change that to a patient care center, with no offense to the Blue Ribbon Committee, because it includes more than just ambulatory care. It is a patient care center for a variety of things. Now let me throw out the next caveat there. We are not prepared at this time to tell you what's on each floor. Staffs, we just mentioned this a couple weeks ago to the executive team, and all of them had 45 different ideas on what should go on each floor. It was interesting because it meant they all cared, because it was all myopic to them. And I appreciate that. That's a team you want. But we're not prepared to say it's 5 stories or 8 stories. We are prepared to say we think the organization needs a patient care tower. And I can assure you one key item would be, and I will say this, is moving those clinics off the second floor of this building and moving them over there, and then increasing your operating capacity, which quite frankly, in all honesty, should have been done back in 2007 when they built the pavilion. When they built the pavilion, all they did was move the number of ORs from this side of the street to that side of the street, and we've been paying the price for that. So looking at OR expansion, looking at the ability to have your clinics move are 2 key efficiencies. Then the third thing that we as staff looked at is the critical crisis we have of having a psychiatric emergency room on the 10th floor of a building. That is, for all practical purposes, not very smart. And we really want to be a smart organization, and we put folks at a higher level of jeopardy by moving them from floor 1 to floor 10, the challenges our police officers have in dealing with that, and it's just a movement of patient, particularly a volatile patient, you don't want. So it makes a great deal of sense to have a psychiatric emergency room on the first floor. So our initial thought was, let's take that psychiatric emergency room and put it next to that patient care tower. The problem with that is when you look long-term, and our long-term goal is to create a new mental health facility, you start running out of space over there pretty quick. And it's not the space so much for the building, because we could cram it in. The problem is all the traffic that you got from a transport standpoint with police officers, people drop off. If you put everything on that side of the street, it makes it very, very difficult. So we know that ultimately what we've looked at and what others have recommended is your mental health facility and your improvement of that in the future is probably somewhere located right close to where Trinity Springs currently is. So why don't we be smart, and in this first level of care, let's put a psychiatric emergency room next to Trinity Springs. That immediately gets us out of the pressure valve we're in right now with the 10th floor. We can expand its space, get it on the first floor, connect it to Trinity Springs. On ultimately 3 or 4 or so years down the line, when you know you're going to need when we have the ability to build the new mental health facility, it's going to be in that area. So you then as a board and we as a staff are not building something today that we look back in 5 years and go, why did we build it there? We're building it there for ultimately where your mental health facility goes, whether that's a 10-story building or a 2-story building or a 30-story building. It won't be 30, I don't want to scare the city. So in that regard, those are our recommendations for that. And then the last thing we would do, the greatest dissatisfier of you all as board members, our patients, our community, our guests, and the people sitting out in the audience is parking. Hands down, biggest dissatisfier here. Now, it is a good litmus test because anybody wants to come visit us, if they park here, they really want to come here because it's a challenge. But if we could look at parking and we could put that in that first part. So let me recap for you all some of our thoughts as staff. We can move quickly, efficiently, and expediently on behalf of our patients to look at expansion of 2 community clinics. Without a site selection at this time, I think that's a good beginning and a start to address the community needs, not all, but the beginning of them. Then we look at the establishment of the patient care center, which you've already got an architect already in line. We put that patient care facility there, and you can begin to address your OR issues and some of your clinic issues that you have here on campus, along with other services that we would come back to y'all and define in greater detail. Then you alleviate the 10th floor challenge that you have with the PEC, and we are struggling there. We are way beyond our capacity, and it is a challenge for our patients and our employees. And the quicker we could do that, the better. We would in all likelihood have to go out for an RFP for that, but that is, correct me if I'm wrong, 26,000 square feet? Is that about what that is?
728, somewhere in there.
27,000 square feet. That is something that an RFP we don't think would take an exceedingly long time. So we would hope between 18 and 24 months to be able to have that project, we would hope. I'm looking at people in the audience, they're just gulping. But I want to move in that direction so that we could do that. Hello, Mr. Powell. So we could move in that direction and alleviate a real significant pressure point for us. And then the last aspect of that would be looking at the parking garage. So we thought, Mr. Petty and myself thought it might help you all as board members if we gave you that recommendation first, and then you all begin to discuss it and figure out if that's the right way. This is just us as staff looking and saying, we think these address our immediate needs right now, but we're happy to have discussion, and your 3 experts are sitting in front of you.
So one thing to keep in mind, sort of globally, there was really 4 criteria that the staff looked at to put this together. And they were urgency of need, time to delivery, capital cost, and capital net impact. And those have all been factors that we've all discussed. We know that, the most expensive element of the entire bond program is going to be the inpatient hospital, the tower. Hundreds of millions of dollars, no question. Gigantic impact on operating taxes. So as I worked with staff to make sure that we had this framed in a way that the committee could really look at it, I think objectively, those were the 4 things. Let's make sure we're looking at the most urgent of need. Let's look at the things that we've got the capital to be able to deploy immediately without a gigantic net operating impact. And let's look at, in terms of capital cost, how can we get this done? And honestly, we're trying to work around a $200 million number. I mean, most of our effort has been trying to look at this first goal of about $200 million or less, because from Sharon's perspective and staff's perspective, and I haven't talked to you, but the financial capacity of this bond, effort is not paying for an $800 million bond off the top. So we had to put this into some perspective to hopefully eliminate, to identify the low-hanging fruit, if you will, and those were the 4 criteria that we sort of applied in doing that. Mm-hmm. So with that, Bill, however you want to proceed, we will.
Well, be happy to answer questions. Thank you, Robert. That was a great presentation.
I have a question. On using those 4 priorities, one of the concerns that I have is in your ER, you now have all of the boarding. So with the site facility being closer, the things that we're doing, will that impact that? That's my one question.
Yes, it will.
Okay.
Bill, is your mic, I don't know if your mic is on, and I can't tell.
It is. So, since January 20th, the purple elevators having been closed, all of the patients that are coming voluntarily are coming to the ED.
Oh, okay.
With the new PEC and having access to that, that's going to mitigate some of that volume,
Okay.
right?
Also, Dorothy, to that point, Bill, you might want to remind her of the expansion that we already have coming online. It's not huge, but you can remind Dorothy of that, which you've already approved.
So hopefully by October,
October 1.
we will have another 15 beds in the ED. It's
Okay.
about 6,000 square feet of expansion.
Okay,
That was the result of building the East invasive lab building, 4 years ago. So that will help tremendously as well, in addition to changing a lot of internal workflows, and in addition to strategically looking at that going forward in 2020 and trying to determine how we can best stem that tide.
okay,
There's a lot of folks coming there that don't need to be there.
right,
Right.
okay. All right.
From an operating and maintenance perspective, if you look at the projects that Robert has outlined, there's going to be an increase in operating expense for the 2 new clinics, if that's the direction that we choose to go.
Okay.
We're not consolidating. We're putting them in locations that currently are the catalyst and the generators and the genesis for some of the volume coming to the ED primarily. Hopefully, we'll address that, but that's going to be new expense.
Okay,
If you look at the patient care center, it's really just transitioning things that we're doing today into a new, more efficient building. Now, you're going to increase some of your depreciation, obviously, with new construction.
right,
But for the most part, the staff expense stays the same. If you
Yeah,
look at the
should.
PEC, we're spending approximately $16 million a year for the psychiatric emergency center. We've got space for 36 chairs, 36 patients. We're averaging 55 every day. But that staff can then transition to a new building, a more efficient building. So there's really no substantial increase in expense
Okay.
for that either. The garage will bring some sort of depreciation expense for us and a little bit of maintenance expense. But as Robert pointed out, that is probably the most significant dissatisfier of anyone that you speak to that sets foot on JPS property.
okay.
And that, if we could do that and alleviate the parking situation that might come about as a result of putting a psychiatric emergency center on an existing parking lot, in addition to staff who have to park remotely, huge win for patients, huge win for the community, huge win for staff. So think at it from an expense perspective. Yeah, we're going to have some principal and interest, right? And we've factored that in on this first tranche. But the true expense is going to come in the clinics. And if you look at Northeast, which is the template that we're looking at with a slight modification of workflow internal, but the footprint is the same, we're spending about $10 million a year on operating expense for that. So that would be in addition to the current expense structure.
Let me follow up on 2 things that Bill mentioned. When we looked at the Northeast, we were located in an old hospital, and it was not conducive to the flow of a clinic. So it was fairly easy to transition that building out, build a new building, and move staff over. We don't know where the next site will be, but you're not going to tear down your facility at, name it, at Como, and you're not going to change Viola Pitts. It would be an addition to. You don't have that circumstance at any of our existing clinics. Possibly, you could look at a few of them, but our major clinics, you're not going to, and even looking preliminary at maps, where you've got your population growth increase and where you've got your population, not only population growth increase, but the JPS traditional patient population increase, you're in likelihood don't have an existing facility. So Bill mentions appropriately, we do have to take into consideration the additional cost of staff, maintenance, and operations. Now, the one thing we don't want to forget is our Arlington facility, which has always been an attempt for us to put square peg in round hole, which has never gone particularly well. I don't think the genesis of the purchase of that building was probably the right thing for the organization to do, or at least challenging. That building has been for sale. When we first put that building up for sale, we got a lot of interest until we told them, can we lease it back from you for 4 years until we can build our new building? Nah, it's like giving a kid a bicycle and say, but you don't get tires for 2 years. So it was a little awkward, so those who were interested in our building quickly did not have so much interest. But if we are able to build the patient care center, that personnel that's currently in Arlington will transfer over. So your M&O will increase slightly, but it will not increase from 0 to whatever the dimension of that cost is. You're going to transfer others, and then you're going to have a slight financial bump on the sale of that property as well. And we've been very disciplined in not selling off pieces of it. We have people that want to buy 1 or 2 acres next to it or whatever. That is a package deal at this point, and we're continuing to work at that. So you do have a little bit of a bump in personnel and not a huge M&O increase. And then you have the bump of whatever the sale of that property would be, because Arlington, as we know, in that area has grown quite a bit, particularly in the commercial area, from when they initially bought that hospital, I don't know, back in 2003 or 2004, whenever they bought it. I don't remember. So that just gives you all a perspective on those. Thanks for the question, Dorothy.
Other questions on the recommendations, and also questions on the reports. Some of you hadn't been here when those reports were built. If you have questions on any of those reports and how those reports ended up on our desk today, now is the time. I mean, if you followed Blue Ribbon at all, you know there was no parking garage, quote unquote, in the Blue Ribbon recommendation. But when you read the report, there was a parking garage in the recommendation because they had to support the existing building. So everything that you've heard from staff was on the Blue Ribbon Committee report, and everything was considered high priority on that report. So I don't think the staff has deviated from where Blue Ribbon intended to go at all with the recommendation today.
I've got a question regarding the community health clinics. We like Northeast, and we like the way that it's turned out and the design. There needs to be some changes. And you mentioned going out for an RFP. And why, like when it comes to architecture, why would we do that?
You wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
Our-
Okay.
My reference to the RFP was for the emergency facility
Oh, okay.
for psych.
I got you. Okay.
We don't have
I was
that.
gonna say,
Yeah.
because that could get moving pretty quick if
No,
we just.
we could, and that was to Trent's point, the expeditious nature of
Okay.
being smart.
All right.
So the clinics would already be taken care of. The only element we don't have that we would want to be certain to be following procedures that are wise for us to, and that would be to go out for an RFP for the psych emergency building, which is the 27,000 square foot, 1-floor building.
In the garage.
And the garage, yes. So that kind of puts things in perspective for you. We truly feel as staff, this is a very smart way to start the bond, and it's a very smart thing. You're going to have to build clinics, no doubt. Nobody would disagree with you. We think this is the best start to that, and we think some of the other ancillaries would be. And then to Trent's point, as we begin to do that, then the big issues after that is the tower and a major mental health facility at some point at this time. The luxury of slightly waiting on the tower is that much more time to watch the various changes in healthcare, because what we don't want to do is build a facility with 800 beds when we should have said, you know what, we probably should have built one with less beds because of the nature of healthcare and its delivery from either telemedicine or home care delivery, those type things.
Bill,
You'll follow up, Roger? I'm sorry.
Bill, you mentioned the Community Clinic Northeast is a net $10 million expense annually. Is that?
Gross.
I'm sorry.
And well worth
I'm not denying that, not doubting that a bit.
That's gross expense, not offset by any revenue.
Right, and so it's a net expense. So do we foresee all the community clinics kind of being the same?
We do.
Financial
We
structure.
do.
So
You know,
two more is net
I
20
don't need to
million.
remind you, but let me talk about a mental health component, because there's some lessons learned from the Northeast Clinic. And we need, the next time we do this, to be able to think about expanding behavioral health. These clinics are going to have a significant behavioral health component, significant. And other services that are out there, we need to think about how we might expand those too as the need grows. So internal flow, I think those are minor issues, but yeah, mental health is a focus.
Have you discussed what your overall mental health for the community would be? I know we talk about there is going to be some expansion, but have y'all sit down and really decide, here is where we want to go with mental health? I mean,
Well, we seem to be the epicenter for mental health right now. If you look at the number of transports, perhaps, from MedStar, which is not all involuntary but voluntary, right? 90% of all the transports come here. If you talk to municipal police departments in Tarrant County, surrounding counties, by practice, not by law, they bring all detention warrants to JPS. And they question, well, we thought we know, but that's by practice. That perhaps needs to be examined as well. Our detention warrants, we're averaging 20 a day. 20 a day, and that's just our police department. That doesn't include all the other municipalities that bring detention warrants to JPS. It is a community issue. It's not a JPS issue.
correct, and I'm
Right.
just asking.
What's
have
our
we-
piece?
Yeah, that's our piece. But because it's a community effort,
Yes, ma'am.
have we kind of said, okay, we're probably going to get that. So this is going to be the plan for JPS, and what are we going to ask the community to do? I would just like to see that overall plan for behavior health for Tarrant County. I mean, it's a little bit more than saying, let's just add a few more beds.
No.
Yeah.
I
mean,
don't
a few
think,
more
to
clinics.
that point, Dorothy, I would agree wholeheartedly. And I don't think we're actually at that very point.
Okay.
I don't think your interest is all of our interest, and that is, what is the overall plan for not only mental health, but what's the overall plan for what you do with we know we need a tower. To what extent, or you know you're going to need something different than the 11 stories that we have right now. What do you do with those 11 stories? And I think that's a continual basis as we go. I don't think anything we're doing right now would be anything you wouldn't do. What we need to figure out is what element of mental health, we put a mental health element in the Northeast. To what extent does that link up to the bigger picture, and what do we put in? And I think part of what's going to be dictated to us is when we get to the heat maps and we really dig down and figure out where those clinics should be. I think you look at that patient population there, and that's some of the services that you offer, which may be different than the Northeast, which may be different than what we offer at Watauga. And I think if that's where JPS really gets smart for the next 10 to 20 years in addressing the population needs to the services we offer in those clinics. And there always will be some level of a mental health component, but what is the subsection of it, such as, is there a stronger geriatric population that we need to address? But you're exactly right. The answer is, how does that overall picture place us? That's why I don't think at this point we're making any mistakes in what we determined to be the overall bigger picture.
I don't see that what we're doing as a mistake. I think that's your first initial start. But as we start that, I would think that you would already be looking, is it all going to be on this campus? Are we going to have any facilities throughout the community? I mean, that's the kind of conversation I know we should start having once you get this portion
Yes, ma'am.
done.
I would not disagree at all.
And so kind of on that particular thing, there were some recommendations in the reporting about the school-based clinics. How is that being introduced within this entire plan?
We started having some discussions, both with Zelia, Joy Parker, Karen Duncan, as to what elements in a potential restructure of school-based clinics should we be offering. So we've done two things. We've begun to have some preliminary conversations with Cook Children's to see what role or how much, because you read through the report, you see a lot about community collaboration. So what should we be doing with Cook Children's in the role that they could or would be willing to play in school-based programs for us, since our PEDS program is not the strength of this organization, and it's not our wheelhouse. The second thing it begs the question is, what can and should we be doing for adolescent psychiatry? And I don't think we're not at that, but I think you're at a point where we can begin to look at the restructure of school-based programs and figure out what goes in there. The other thing we've had a lot of discussion about, with Joy Parker taking the lead, is the aspects of telemedicine in school-based. We have a hard time right now sometimes because you literally have to go from the school to the clinic, which may not be far, but you have to have a parent and a guardian to do that. And so we have a few disconnects. So we've addressed that by beginning to open up initial talks with who wants to provide services, at what level do you want to provide services, and what should those services look like. Two things came out of that initial discussion. One, pediatrics, or the aspects of everything that we're doing right now, may not be our wheelhouse. Psychiatric need and concerns is definitely a JPS wheelhouse, so should we look to that? And is Cook or any other organization willing to partner or work with us in the services that we would provide?
What is the school, I mean, you're in the school, are they addressing any of their behavior needs? Because they're talking at some of their meetings about behavior issues that they're having in the school. So is the school a part of that conversation? Because we are there, if we're doing telemedicine, we're gonna have, that might be someone we need to talk to, because they are having some major behavior.
They are.
issues
They're
in
not only
those
having
schools.
major behavioral problems,
district.
they're major challenges for our schools, as we know, just seeing it from what shows up at our clinics in the school-based structure. We would definitely work with the schools and work with what role a school nurse should play in their existing structure that they have, and figure out the best ways to do that. So that would be a part. But the great luxury there is we already have a structure. It's amending the structure or continuing with status quo with new support. But we have that structure, and we've taken that seriously from the report. Chuck, you had a question?
Just transport question. So from the current emergency room, be using what, the long tunnel to get over to a new psychiatric facility?
I don't know that we've actually would use the tunnel for transport.
We do in emergencies. If
Yeah, I know we do now. I know we do now.
What would be the plan, though, with a psychiatric?
Zia, you might want to hit the mic and talk about that, from having a person come from one place to the other.
Transport has been,
Sure,
Big deal.
big deal.
I'm fine, I've been sitting. So are you asking about, like, if it's built over by TSP, about transport?
Yes.
no, well, yes, but
Okay.
the plan would be, currently is, we have patients come in our current
ER.
emergency room that on arrival there are deemed in one form or another to require hospitalization. That means transport from our current ER to the new facility, wherever it is over there.
Correct.
Just ask, would be using the long tunnel, and if not, what would you use?
It would have to be police or medical escort, but I will say that with new processes that we've been putting into place in the medical ER now, we are staffing an RN and a behavioral tech in there now, as well as the middle of September, we will start having a psychiatric nurse practitioner, as well as 2 licensed counselors 24/7. And so we're going to be able to do some very thorough evaluations right there in the medical ER. And so the ones that do meet criteria for admission, those individuals would be transported via the tunnel or via police to Trinity Springs. But we get a lot of patients right now. And prior to the front part of the PEC being closed, when the elevators were shut down, now that volume's going to the medical ER, as Bill said, and that's about 1,000 patients a month. And so those patients would start coming back to the PEC once we, if you all approve, have the new PEC built. And instead of the police having to go through the medical ER to come up to the PEC, they can now, they'll be able to directly go to the PEC as well, the new one.
And let me emphasize that again. The police have learned over years, but this is not a conducive environment to know you go to the 10th floor. If you have a psychiatric emergency room on the first floor in a prevalent spot that you can get in and out of quickly, that conditioning is going to change really quickly, and I think you're going to have less that just go immediately to the emergency room, voluntary or involuntarily, and they'll go to that center. Just like when we opened up the urgent care facility over here, for the first couple of months, everybody, I didn't know we had one, and then all of a sudden, that bifurcation started happening just on its own. So I think, Chuck, you'll actually see a much greater ability to get people in the right spot for a variety of reasons, just in its location on the first floor.
And we also have a patient family advisory committee over at TSP, and the families would be extremely excited to have it located by TSP at the ground floor, because right now when they're bringing their loved ones in, they're parking in one of the parking decks, and they're trying to navigate the entire hospital to get to the 10th floor with their loved one who is going through a difficult time, and at times that can be very challenging for the family member to even get them to the PEC. So this does afford them an easy entrance in the new proposal as well.
Thank you, and you did that all standing up. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Roger.
So, I'm sorry, Dr. These 4 items in the order, they seem fine to me, and that's about $200 million, you said.
200 million.
So what's the time frame? Because these things can be going simultaneously, these 4 different projects. That's not a big deal. But when you start talking about the inpatient psych and the hospital bed tower, do we begin design? I know that there's going to be future changes in medicine and we want to be on the cutting edge. Sure. But I think there's also something to be said about the overall economy and us being able to strike while the iron's hot, so to speak. Not when it's at a boom like it is now, but when it's at kind of a bust. And I'm in construction, and I hate to jinx it. It's like saying 7 at the craps table, but we might have the opportunity to save a chunk of money, and I don't want to go through and 4 years later we have no ideas or no design on what the future is going to be, because then we're 2 years of design and we may not hit the wave
I
right.
think that's a great point, Roger, and that's come up, in a lot of different discussions, in a lot of different realms. And I hope that, where planning wants to encourage is that everything about this bond committee now becomes a concurrent process. I don't think any of us have the intention of setting aside, the bed tower for 10 years. I think we all have to be conscious of what the financial limitations are, but at the same time, to your point, the last thing we want to do is having looked back and said, we should have done this at X, Y timeframe. So hopefully our process will be all about now concurrent activity. And I think as we get into the psych tower and the bed tower, there's going to be a lot more discussions among us in terms of exactly how that gets delivered. There's huge financial issues, but there's also gigantic implications of transportation and access in this facility for the current structures. So I hope that, the effort, Robert, is going to be, we look at everything now concurrently. We have to pick the low-hanging fruit and get started, because the community needs us to get started on some critical issues. But I don't think anybody plans on letting any grass grow under their feet.
Not only will there not be grass grow, but the important aspect, and you'll see that when you get the budget, because we're going through that process right now, you'll see some initiatives as we as staff are trying to bring additional money into JPS in a proper way that doesn't create community upheaval and can do things. I think the other part of that too, Roger, is to what extent, and I mentioned it earlier with Cook, to what extent are our colleagues interested in collaborating with us? For example, and I use Cook because I don't think they would mind me saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, so it's too late. But if Cook is looking at heat maps and Cook is thinking, you know what, we should put a clinic here and here, why would we not potentially, if it fits our heat map, partner with them? And you have a JPS Cook Clinic where you get wellness at a 360 level. And then why don't we look at the possibility of partnering with THR in certain capacities? So we as staff and Sharon and her finance team are going to present to you more in the budget from an initiative standpoint, but I think we got to look at that even greater. And as I mentioned before, I may make y'all as a board feel slightly uncomfortable. It's not my goal, but it is my goal to take property that we have and utilize it far greater than what we utilize it for now, in the hopes of a revenue stream off the property that we have where we park cars on. So answering your question, we don't want to wait 6 years, and we want to hit the bubble of where we are, but at the same time, a major force in that is what can we afford in a debt? And what can we be able to pay so that we don't come back to y'all in a year and say, we got a bond we can't get out of, so the only thing we can cut is services. And I don't want to be in that situation. So we want to be smart in how we do it.
Good question.
I have one comment for you. You mentioned additional revenue stream. As part and parcel of this, I think you ought to look at where will a claim have an additional revenue stream
Sure.
as well.
And that's a good point, and we are looking at a claim, and we are looking at what role can a claim play, and what role is there a community need for JPS to play a portion of that where we have historically not. And again, being sensitive to community upheaval, but at the same time, realizing that the community in a new era needs to look at JPS in a new direction too, because we're going to be doing things in a different manner, in a different way, because that keeps our mission strong. And our mission strong means we have a stronger service line, which directly impacts our colleagues. And we want to make sure that we're always there for them and for our patients. Great question.
It can be either expansion of services, or it can be managing the population that we have. And we can save a lot from the
It's
post-acute
both.
care overall.
What you will see,
Margin's better.
what you will see, DT, to not take any of Sharon's thunder away, but what you'll see in the budget this time is an initiative to look, to stop the discussion and put into place plans to deal with our connection population and how you manage that population like any other insurance company would, even though we're not an insurance company. We've got 32,000 people. We know who they are. We know how they utilize our system. What are we doing about it? So you'll see some of those initiatives, as you'll see in some of our revenue stream and what we've done in revenue enhancement, just the preliminaries in this budget. And that really goes to Roger's question as to how quickly and fast we can move.
Robert, I guess several concerns I have or questions. One is that I think we also need to consider that there's going to be some redistricting, new districts, council, commissioner districts, or changes in that in the next year or two. Okay. Then we talk about where we see the biggest need for clinics. Okay. Also, I think we need to consider that how we sold the bond program. And I'm sitting here thinking, wow, because did we all in our particular areas in the community sell it new bed tower? Did we sell it? We're going to have clinics, you know. So now, what do we do if we now reestablish what our priorities are? You know, we see that we want to do clinics now before we do the bed tower. Then it appears that we may need to go back and do some kind of marketing to the community based on here's what we see we're going to do at this immediate juncture. Because I said to you, in parts of the community, they're looking at a bed tower. Okay? The parts of the community said we need psych facilities. So what do we do? But as we look at how the city is growing and expanding, I'm not so sure that we need to put new clinics just because the city, county is growing. It might be areas where we might have to put another neighborhood facility, community facility, health facility, then expand to the new areas. I mean, just based on qualified need. in those areas. And so, but if we're going to develop a new priority list, or if we ever had a priority list, I think that needs to come out of the board quickly, is that based on what we talk about around this table, here's what we see now where our priority list is for construction, and then go back and re-educate the community on this is where we're gonna go.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Ralph. One of the conditions, and Steve, you support me on this, argue with me on this, you were there just like I was. The Blue Ribbon Committee didn't say, let's create a 1, 2, 3 priority list.
Right.
They said, these are the critical needs, and then they expanded on those needs. The good thing is that regardless of what messages were sent throughout the community, when it comes back to the basis on which that bond campaign was structured, every one of these were considered high priorities by Blue Ribbon. And so there very well may be expectations relative to bed tower. I don't think it's fair to categorize it as a reprioritization, because I think it's consistent with the original list that was put out there. Now, if we were coming up here with something that was a brand-new idea that wasn't even discussed, then I think that would probably be a problem for us. But, I mean, Steve, your recollection of Blue Ribbon, how do you respond to that?
I think what you've put forth so far echoes the priority list of Blue Ribbon, and I specifically remember we didn't put it in a particular priority, this has to be done first, second, or third. It was, as a group, what was the most critical services that need to be added, and I think you've actually hit them all, or the vast majority of them.
One of the, just to supplement that thought, there was a great deal of discussion. If you go back and look at these reports from Boca Powell all the way to Cummins and Blue Ribbon, there was a huge amount of discussion related to strategies that JPS should begin to deploy to manage population health in a way that reduces the demand of inpatient facilities. And that's just got to be a continued effort for us. And one of the things I know that Robert and the staff have worked on when it comes to budget this year and subsequently is going to be strategies related to what is the culture of healthcare, back to Dorothy's point, what is the culture of healthcare doing? Which direction is it heading? And to the extent that we potentially have some ways to deploy new techniques, new programs that ultimately would reduce that bed tower demand, then that speaks to us on two levels. First, we meet the community need at a certainly more efficient level, but it keeps us in a much better position when it comes to putting operating cost next to capital cost. And so I think it's a great point, and I think we're gonna all have to continually look at how we market these ideas in the community and continue to, push these strategies forward. And again, I think every community, you're right, had different thoughts about maybe what's most important to them.
I do think, Pastor, that you have the ability, as we do, I don't think any of our initial recommendations are out of line. I think you could go back to a community and know that there is a mental health component to every one of our clinics. To know that one of our most immediate needs right now is the safety of that psychiatric emergency room on the 10th floor, and be able to address that. And then outreach to the community. The other challenge that we had, if you look at the needs, which are great, that those who wanted a patient tower to be first is more challenging simply from the standpoint of the larger cost of it. As we, to Roger's question or point, to look at those collaborative efforts and look at what we can do to potentially either bring that down or figure out additional revenue streams for JPS. So I'm not suggesting at all. I think you're exactly right. We have to educate the community. We have to tell them why we're doing it, what we did, and how it falls in line with a lot of the comments we've already made. So I don't disagree with you one bit.
Staff here at JPS and our outlying clinics are in the trenches every day.
Yes, sir.
But also, they're involved in all the new movements and the trends in healthcare.
Yes, sir.
And I really feel comfortable, and I think it'll only be fair that we allow the staff to come with some recommendations.
Great.
And then we talk about that. because one of the things that we have to be careful of, all of us have our little pet projects. And we want to be careful that we don't push for our pet project and we miss the key components of what we want to deliver healthcare.
Did all of you staff hear that what Pastor just said? We can't look at our pet projects? I'm just saying. Thank you. Well, it applies universally. It applies universally. Thank you, Pastor.
Zim, you had a question?
It's more a comment, I think, than a question. I'm not smart enough, I think, at this point to ask any substantive questions. But when we use the term low-hanging fruit, I assume we're talking about those imminent priorities that we need to take care of now.
Yes, sir.
We really haven't, as I can see it, we really haven't set up a series of priorities with timetables that go with them. They're all priorities to us right now. And so what this board has got to do now is start to put timelines and budget to go with that. And we need to be looking at what we need to be doing now, and we need to be what we're going to look at next. You had phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they all look the same to me.
Yes, sir.
They all had towers in them, they all had this and that. As the Reverend points out, none of us know where healthcare is going in the future. You can paint any one of a number of pictures, and some of them aren't that good. So when you look at the investment that we would be making in the tower, it's in our best interest to make sure that we've kind of gone down a road a ways before we start jumping into that. I'm always amazed when we build roads. It takes about 10 years to get a road built, and by the time it's open, it's out of date and it's under capacity again, and so we have to start all over again. So I think that's one of the challenges we're going to have here, because a road is one thing, a tower is something else. So I think we really need to look at that and make sure we've got that figured out as to what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to do it, how many floors it is, how many beds it is, all that kind of stuff. So I have no problem with delaying that, if you will, to get some of these more imminent priorities that I think what Trent is saying when he says low-hanging, they're easy to go do, and we need them right now. So that's my comment.
Appreciate the comment.
And I think it's, Bill, Angie, I mean, tell me how y'all want to do this, but you've done some discussion already about schedule and what, yeah. Can you walk us through from these specific projects, what you see as timing options for us?
Let me give you as much detail as I know, and if you have further questions, people in my right can answer those. But you laid it out last month during the board meeting. You know, from a timing perspective, these two clinics, if that was something that this board chose to approve, we could start those in February of next year. We know what that design basically looks like. We've got the architectural documents to bid that project. The completion of that is probably less than 2 years. If you look at the patient care center, which is relocating all of the clinics here and bringing the procedure rooms and the ORs from Arlington on this campus, that's probably a 3-year project, more than likely. With the schedule that Lou and Angie have laid out, that would be 3 years if we started, you know, in the next few months. The psychiatric emergency center, with a fast-track process of that could be completed within 18 to 20 months. We feel confident with that. We basically have an understanding of what the design looks like, should look like. It's kind of an open concept. It would not take that long at all.
DT?
As we look at the planning, I know there's a lot of work that was done with the blue ribbon and everything else, and I think they do a very, very good job there. But I can't help but, you know, suggest a little bit that we may want to take a look at, because of the changing in healthcare population and technology and all that stuff, to reach out rather than pull people in. We might want to take a look at shortly, spend some time with the micro hospital to see if it's appropriate for our model, rather than just big, you know, population health center and all that stuff. Because I think we may have to reach out to, because of traffic and all that stuff in the next 10, 20 years. And we can do that for urgent care to relieve some of the high burden
Yes,
from the central location, but high cost to a more suburban area type thing also as well, so.
I agree. Good point.
Yeah, wow, that kind of gets on where I was thinking when we look at setting priorities. And that's one reason I was suggesting that we hear really in detail from staff on where you see our next moves would be. Because I was asking myself, one of the things is we have the Mercedes-Benz out at Northeast now. Clinic.
It's okay, Roger.
Oh, sorry, Roger.
It's been going great.
Roger and I have thick skin, we have thick skin.
But what things at the Northeast facility we didn't do? Or that we could move from here there if we had done some things different, okay? So that says if we look at those new clinics, then that maybe then takes the load off of the main campus, or we could transfer services. So I would hope we somewhat look at that. So what DT, the micro, that could, relieve some of the workload, or we could maybe add some things in here as we go forward.
Yes, sir.
Now, one other question. If we went to single bedrooms now, how much would that reduce? How many beds rooms would we reduce?
Would you lose?
If we went to
Went to
private rooms
private rooms, how
Private
many
rooms,
rooms
no.
would we take away
from the existing
from the
facility.
existing facility? Yeah, how many beds would we take away?
Over half our beds are semi-private.
Yeah.
On this side of the
On
street.
this side of the street.
Everything over there is private.
So what, a swag, 200 beds? Yes, sir.
Yeah, wow.
It is a lot, no question. Yep, that is a challenge for us.
And that was also one of the big reasons we put that tower there, because we talked about nobody wanted to go to a hotel and stay in the room with someone else. And we still know that you can't use them as two beds sometime, depending on what disease the patient have. So I think that as we move on these priorities, we still need to be looking at what your towers, because it's,
No doubt.
I don't want any more, we're gonna have some of the, what's the what you send out the notices on now, when you are backed up in the ER?
Oh, the boarding. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the orange something, orange.
Oh, code yellow.
Code yellow.
Sorry.
You know, don't forget those code yellows.
Don't be asking me color questions, but go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Y'all are not saying anything we haven't said in our in-depth meetings as well.
Okay.
We do need a short executive session. Some of this discussion relates to things that are executive session qualified, so I'm not rushing it, but if you're willing to go into that now, we can. If you've got more questions for the staff, we'd happy to entertain those too. Everybody good?
Everybody good. I won't
Very
throw
good.
my other
Well, then it is
ID out there.
4:35. We're going to adjourn to a brief executive session. We'll come back as soon as we're finished. Probably 30 minutes.